If you're watching this video and you wouldn't consider yourself a Jesus follower or a Christian, firstly, I am so glad that you stopped by our channel. I hope that you find the content here helpful. But secondly, we're going to answer this question: what difference does Easter make? Now, if you're not a Jesus follower, maybe you've asked this question before in some variation. What difference does faith make? What difference does God make? What difference does Jesus make? Well, in this special Easter episode of Beyond at Home, we're going to help you answer that question. But we're going to start in a place that maybe you've never heard of before. And if you're a Jesus follower, we're going to start in a place that you're really familiar with. But maybe because you're so familiar with it, you just kind of glaze over it. So let's go on a journey this Easter and answer that question together. What difference does Easter make? Now, you might not be aware of this, but Jesus was Jewish. And a big part of Jewish culture is festivals. And one festival that the Jewish people would have celebrated and Jesus would have celebrated, Jewish people still celebrate today, is a festival called Passover. And really this festival is a way for the Jewish people to remember when they became free from Egyptian rule. In their minds, this festival is a moment in time where they reflect and celebrate the way that God rescued them from the oppression of the Egyptians. And on this particular Passover, which would have happened on a Thursday night, Jesus and his followers are celebrating the festival. And Jesus takes this meal that they would have celebrated at Passover and redefines it, gives it a brand new meaning and makes it new. In fact, if you're a Jesus follower, you've probably celebrated in this new meal that Jesus defined on that night. We call it the Lord's Supper or communion. And even if you're not a Jesus follower, you probably know a little bit about that meal. On that night, as Jesus and his followers are finishing up the meal, one of Jesus' disciples, Judas, left into the night. Now, none of the other disciples would have thought much of this at the time because Judas was their treasurer. So they probably thought that Judas was just leaving to fix up some of the bills or maybe pay the owner of the home whose room they were using to celebrate the meal. But little did they know that 2 days prior, Judas had met with the leading religious officials. And together they had hatched a plan to capture and kill Jesus because the teachings of Jesus were subverting power away from the religious leaders. And so Judas had stepped away into the night to betray Jesus. Shortly after Judas leaves into the night, Jesus and his followers leave as well. And they go to this mountain ridge just outside of Jerusalem called the Mount of Olives. And they head to this specific section of the mountain, the Garden of Gethsemane. And when Jesus gets there, he leaves his main group and he takes Peter, James, and John, his three best mates. And he says, hey, I want you to come with me a little bit. And as they're walking up the garden a little bit further, he says to them, my soul is crushed to the point of grief. I'm going to go ahead, but would you stay here? Would you stay awake and pray with me? And what Jesus is saying in this moment, he's saying, I'm in my deepest hour of need. Would you just stay and would you pray with me? And in the moment when Jesus needs his friends the most, do you know how they respond? They fall asleep on him. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And as Jesus comes back for the 3rd time, feeling crushed and deflated, out of the darkness come a group carrying clubs. And leading that group, Judas. And Judas walks up to Jesus and kisses him on the cheek, which is the sign to the crowd, this is the man we're going to capture. And under the cover of darkness, they take Jesus away to the home of the Jewish high priest to be tried. As Jesus was being taken by the mob, all of his followers fled. Real tough, I know. Peter stayed, but even Peter followed from a distance. And as Jesus was taken to the Jewish high priest's house, Peter finds himself outside in the courtyard, warming himself by the fire, while Jesus is inside, experiencing one of the most one-sided trials in history. On one side, there's Jesus, and on the other side, there's the Jewish leaders, making up all sorts of false claims about him to the Jewish high priest. And all the while these claims are being thrown at him, Jesus remains silent, until eventually, the Jewish high priest turns and looks at Jesus and asks him a question, to which Jesus replies, I am, which was enough for all of the Jewish leaders to scream out blasphemy, essentially talking disrespectfully to God, and ask for him to be crucified. But there was a problem.
Because you see, the Jewish authorities couldn't crucify or kill Jesus simply for blasphemy. See, they were under occupation by the Romans, which meant that in order for a capital crime to be sanctioned, they had to get approval from the Roman governor. So instead, what they did is they blindfolded Jesus. They spit in his face and they marched him out towards the Roman governor. Now, as if this wasn't enough, while Jesus is experiencing this trial, Peter is outside, like I said, in the courtyard, warming himself by the fire. And one of the Jewish high priest's staff walk up to him. This staff member was actually a middle school aged girl. And she says to Peter, "Hey, aren't you one of the guys who was with Jesus?" To which Peter goes, No, that wasn't me. And then that staff member starts going around and talking to other people and pointing at Peter and saying, "Hey, isn't that one of the guys who was with Jesus?" And not once, not twice, but 3 times Peter says, No, I didn't have anything to do with him. I'm not connected to that guy in any way, shape, or form. The worst part is still to come.
Because as the sun starts to rise, the religious leaders need to get approval from Rome in order to execute Jesus. So they take Jesus to the governor Pontius Pilate for a decision. But Pilate doesn't really know what to do with Jesus, and he wants to kind of abdicate his responsibilities. And when he finds out that Jesus is a Galilean, he sends him away to Herod for a verdict. Unfortunately for Pilate, Herod doesn't render a verdict and sends him back to Pilate. And Pilate's put in an uncomfortable position. So he tries to evoke a ritual or a practice in order to get himself out of making this decision. And he says to the crowd, "Every single year I release a criminal. This year I'm going to give you an option. Do you want Barabbas, a convicted murderer, released, or Jesus released?" And the crowd unanimously screams, "Let Barabbas go. We want Jesus crucified." Pilate is still unsure of what to do with Jesus, because in his mind, Jesus hasn't committed a crime. And Pilate is so desperate that he even turns to the crowd and says, "What would you have me to do with Jesus?" And they scream louder and louder and louder, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate fears that the crowd is going to get out of control, that a riot is going to spread, and his head is going to be on the line when Rome finds out how he let this town that he was governor over turn into a riot. So Pilate does the unthinkable. Pilate has Jesus whipped with a lead-tipped whip that would have ripped flesh and bone away from his body. And then he hands Jesus over to the Jews. And he says, "Do with him as you want."
From here, the Roman soldiers would have put a purple robe on him and rammed a crown of thorns down on his head. And they would have forced him to carry his own cross. At one point, this cross became so heavy that a man named Simon from Cyrene had to help him. And where he led him to was a hill outside the city of Jerusalem called Golgotha, which meant the place of the skull. From here, Jesus' hands and feet would have been nailed to the cross. His feet would have been overlaid and a nail would have been driven through the feet. His hands a nail would have been driven through the wrists. And from this point in time, in order for Jesus to breathe, he would have had to push up on the nail through his feet in order to gasp for air. And for 6 hours, God hung on a cross and gasped for air, tortured, beaten, and broken by his own creation. And after 6 hours, Jesus pushes up and says the words, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And after he said those words, he slumped down and gave up his life. And at the foot of the cross is a Roman centurion who is responsible for guarding and crucifying Jesus. And he sees these events unfold. He concludes, surely he, meaning Jesus, was the Son of God. Because Jesus was crucified on a Friday, this was significant. Because in Jewish culture, Saturday was a day called Sabbath, which was a day where everyone ceased working and took a day to rest. And so Joseph of Arimathea got special permission from Pontius Pilate to take Jesus' body down off the cross so that they could prepare his body for burial before the Sabbath. And Joseph, along with Nicodemus, took Jesus' body to the family tomb of Joseph in a local garden. And they began together the embalming process. And while they wouldn't have finished it, they would have done enough to get Jesus' body ready by Jewish standards. They would have embalmed him with around 35 kilos of myrrh and spices and wrapped his body in linen. Their plan was to come back on Sunday and finish the job. And as they leave, they roll a massive stone across the entrance to the tomb, probably 3 or 4 times the size of this stone. And as they turn their backs on the tomb, they walk past the Roman guards who are guarding the tomb. And across the way, they see Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus. And in that moment, Mary hadn't just lost a son, but the people had lost hope as well. Because Jesus had turned out not to be a savior. He couldn't even save himself. And in that moment, Mary hadn't just lost a son, but the people had lost hope. Because Jesus turned out not to be their savior. He couldn't even save himself. And now his body lay wrapped in burial spices and encased in a rock tomb. And in this moment, you might feel exactly how the very first followers of Jesus felt. Confused. Because your question still hasn't been answered. What difference does Easter make? And the truth is, the very first followers of Jesus, after witnessing the death of Jesus, would have felt the exact same way. But the good news is that Friday is only good because of what happens on Sunday.